Well, I hope you had a great break. I stepped outside and I can't believe how awesome it is out there. It's October 21st. I was outside in shorts. I guess I'm wearing a sweater, but shorts and a sweater, and it was beautiful. Uh, my backyard, the trees are starting to turn, but I think I've still got a little bit of time before we get really colorful. So before the break, where we left off was I said we're going to have to rig up some kind of way to click on these different little items in the recycler view and then pass restaurant information into a different activity. So let's start looking at how we can do that. And as part of that, we're going to be digging in again a little bit as to how these recycler views work. So I tried to capture this. This is a bit of a roadmap for us in terms of how this all comes together. So what we're going to do is we need to send the restaurant ID to a view model factory. That view model factory will populate the restaurant ID into the view model so we can properly query Firestore and get the data back. And then we will create another recycler view for our comments based on the information we get back from Firestore. Oh, our animation's just a hint out of order here. So the view model factory is going to pass the restaurant ID to the view model. That view model is really, that's our live connection to the database. And that's where we have this mutable live data object that is going to feed our activities. Okay, so that's the connection to Firebase's Firestore. And then whenever you have these recycler view items, we have to have an adapter, something that takes our data, which is in the view model, and puts it into these layouts. Okay, so that's, I know it's a lot to get your minds around, and I think I mentioned this last week. When I first learned recycler view, there was some sleepless nights. There was some head banging on the wall. So that's why I've tried to conceptualize these in drawings and different tools, because when you look at it, the actual amount of code is so little to make these things work, which is really cool. We just have to understand that big picture. So in order to get this restaurant ID, we need to adapt our existing adapter, right? So we have an adapter for our restaurant view right now. So let's go into that. So we have something, we called it the grid adapter. Okay, so its goal was to bridge between data on one side and a layout file on the other. Let's zoom in a little here for you. And let's just compress this a little bit. So at the high level, these adapters, we have it taking in the context, which is which activity we're currently in. Usually we'll pass in the word this, and a list of restaurants. So that's what the adapter takes as an input. So again, it's a bridge between the data, which is the list of restaurants, and these layout files. And it extends, so that's what's going on here. If it was written in Java, it would say extends, but it's saying that it's a specialized version, or it's extending the recyclerview.adapter class, and it's going to take in this thing called a view holder. And the view holder, let's expand this one little bit more, is our own custom class. It's an inner class. That's why we were able to write grid adapter.restaurant view holder. And all that this view holder was doing was connecting our item view. So it was connecting this text view and those stars close some of these down. By calling item find view by ID and getting the actual text view object. Okay, so the view holder is just getting us the actual, that XML layout file. And then there were 3 other methods. One of the methods said get item count. So all it does is really return how big that list is, right? So if I expand it, it's just restaurants.size. And this one here says onCreate view holder. This one is basically taking our items, our like the item layout, and populating that into our the parent, the recycler view that's holding all these items. And then down here, the onBind view holder, its job is to go through that list of restaurants and assign specific data, like restaurant-specific data, to each of those elements from our view holder. So when you break it down, it's not, it's not a lot of code, and it's very pattern-based. But the thing is, here, we're creating that linkage, but we need to also, have a way to have this idea of a click listener in here. And so what I'm going to do, much like up here where we create an inner class, I'm going to create kind of an inner interface. So I'm going to say interface restaurant item listener. Okay, so we're going to create our own custom listener here. And, well, an interface that says we need a listener. And in it, we're going to say that any class that implements this listener, this interface, needs to have a function or a method called restaurant selected, and it will pass in a restaurant object. Okay, so all that I've done, the only thing I've changed so far to our grid adapter is I've added this interface to it. Okay, and the interface at this point, you can see it's grayed out, isn't being used, but we're going to use it now. And the way that we use this is we pass it in. So we say up here in our grid adapter, we have to have a context as an argument and a list of restaurants. And we're going to pass in as well an item listener. And you can see it auto guessed that it'd be a restaurant item listener. And it's actually kind of interesting how this all works. We're going to create that item listener now in our activity, and we can pass it in. Okay, so all I've added here is 3 little words on line 13. And there's one other little thing we need to do here. When we're setting up our view holder, this onBind view holder, what it's doing, again, is it's connecting the actual data of the restaurant to a specific item layout. So this is really where we have everything pulled together. So in here, we're going to do one more thing, which is we're going to say holder dot item view. I called it view holder here, sorry. View holder. Set on click listener. So it probably almost feels like we're going in circles a little bit with the way that this rolls out. But essentially here, we have a view holder that's holding our XML, and here we've kicked it with the restaurant, and we're setting a click listener up on it. So if someone clicks it, what it's going to do is it's going to call the method restaurant selected and pass in whatever the restaurant is for that particular view holder. And if you're sitting there going, what? It's okay. Honestly, the first few times I had to watch and rewatch videos and read up on it to kind of get my head around it. But basically, this section here is where we're connecting the data to the view, right? That view object. So all we're doing is we're adding a click listener. So if someone clicks it, we're going to pass in that restaurant into the restaurant selected method as an argument. That's all that this does. Okay, so Eric's question is, if we had done it this way with view holder, then all we'd have to do is say item view. So in the group chat, Eric was asking about that, and yes, you can, because when you say with, it's the equivalent of you're saying view holder dot for everything in here. So yeah, you could totally do it that way. Whatever your preference is, they're doing the exact same thing. Okay, so our adapter's all set up now. So let's go into our activity and update this oh so slightly. So I'm going to go into grid recycler activity. And in here, we have our view model that gets our data from Firestore for the restaurants. And we say view model get restaurants observe, which sets up this active listener that'll look for any changes and update our activity real time. And then we created our own instance of the grid adapter that we were just working on. And you can see now it's erroring out. See, I've got this little error here because it was expecting this item listener to be passed in, and we didn't pass one in. So what we're going to do is create our own little item listener. There's one other thing I need to do, which is our grid recycler activity. It extends the app compat activity automatically. That's out of the box. But we also want it to extend the interface that we just created. So what we do is we say comma, and we're going to say grid adapter dot restaurant item listener. Okay, so that means it extends the app compat activity class, and it implements the restaurant item listener interface. And you can see if I don't have any method for this, it complains. So I just have to put my cursor anywhere in our class, and I hold down Alt-Enter, and I say implement the members. And you see it's forcing us now to have a method called restaurant selected. So I'll say OK. So now the restaurant selected method, this is where we basically say, well, what do we want it to do when a restaurant gets clicked? So what I want to do is I want to change to a new activity. So who remembers what it's called when you change from one activity to another? Who remembers what that little bit of code is? Eric. Eric gets intent super fast. It's like Lindsay's not even playing anymore. You had that so fast. All right. So Val, intent. You know, she didn't even reply to my comment. I'm wondering if she didn't know. Oh, yeah, she actually said that. Okay, I figured maybe she stepped away from the computer. All right, so we're going to create a new intent, and we put in our current context, and where we want to go is the comment activity. And when we go from one activity to the other, we want certain information to be passed into the new activity. So we can say intent, put extra, and I'm going to pass in the restaurant ID, and the spelling on this is case sensitive, important. I've had challenges with it before where I have like a lowercase d and stuff, and I'm like, why isn't it working? It was like a simple case sensitivity. And here I can say restaurant.id. And we'll put the restaurant name. And start the activity. So when a restaurant is selected, it's going to automatically call that method. So we need to let our grid adapter know about that. By just saying this. Okay, so this class is both an activity, right? So a context, but because it implements our grid adapter item listener, it's also an item listener. So let's hit play. So now, when I click on a restaurant, it takes me to that new activity. Now, I haven't done anything to wire up the names to show and stuff here, but it does work to change from one activity to the next. So I'm going to just commit that to GitHub now. All right, so now we have the ability to go from one scene to the next, and we have the ability to send information onto our next activity. So now we can go into our comment activity and pull that information out of the intent. So I'm going to go to the comment activity now. So in here, if I say binding dot, we have this restaurant name text view. So that's where the restaurant name goes. So we'll grab the text part of that, and we'll say it equals get string extra. So we asked the intent that got us here to give the string extra for the restaurant name. And now when I click on a restaurant, you can see it gets populated at the top of our activity. So hopefully you're looking at that going, that's pretty slick. That's nice and easy to use. It's a lot, I think it's a lot better than like in a browser where you've got this huge URL with a bunch of potentially a lot of information in the URL string itself. Okay. So in our big pathway here, we've now got part of this created. We've got this restaurant ID to the view model factory. Actually, we don't have that done yet. We still need to do that piece. But we've created a click listener that can navigate to the comments activity and pass in the restaurant information. So the next thing we need to do is create this view model factory, right? So now we need to be able to put this information into a view model factory, and we have to use a view model factory to pass the information into our view model that we want for our comments. And I know it probably feels like a lot of steps, but it's not that bad once you start playing with it. So the view model factory, I've put here some example code. And what I want you to recognize with a lot of these things is it's really, you're making minor modifications to some boilerplate code. So if you look here, there we go, to the items in red, this is really all you have to modify each time. So if you only want to pass in our case, we just want to pass in the restaurant ID. That's all I need to access the restaurant in Firestore. So my view model, my factory, accepts a restaurant ID as an argument. And then this, this method in here, this method of create, it's all the same every time. The only thing you really have to do here is call your view model and pass in your ID or whatever you want to pass in. So that's it. Those are the two things that change. So hopefully you're looking at it going, oh, okay, it seems like a pain, but it's not really a lot of code. And I did try numerous times to try to work around this. Like, why do I need this thing? But just the way they've built the view model package, it gives a lot of heartache if you don't have the view model factory for passing information in. So if anyone figures a way around it, let me know. But I certainly couldn't. So let's build our view model factory. So I'm going to go into my Java section here, up top. I'm going to right click and say new Kotlin class. And I'm going to call this the comment view model factory. And what we want to pass into it as an argument is the restaurant ID, and that's a string. And it's going to extend the view model provider dot factory class. And because we're extending the view model provider dot factory class, you can see here that we have to implement certain methods. So if I do Alt-Enter and I implement the members, we have to have this method called create. And in here, we're going to add a little bit of code. We're going to say if the model class, so what was assignable from So basically what we're saying is, if this is a type of comment view model, okay, if we're working with a comment view model, we haven't built it yet, so that's why it's in red, then return comment view model and pass in the restaurant ID. Okay, so basically, if we're using this with a comment view model, which we're about to build, then we can pass in the restaurant ID. And I don't know all the things that are happening inside of this view model provider.factory class. Obviously, it's passing in and sanitizing, doing whatever it needs to do to make it work with view models. So now let's build our view model for the comments. So I'm going to right click again and say new Kotlin class, and I'm going to call it the comment view model. So now that I have that, now that I have my comment view model, you can see most of these referential errors disappeared. And it's giving me an error because currently I haven't defined a constructor for my comment view model. So it doesn't think that we should be passing anything in. So let's change that. So in the comment view model, I'm going to pass in the restaurant ID as a string. And we're going to extend the view model class. So I think I have a slide on this. So when we looked at the view models for restaurants, we looked at that just earlier in the class, so I'm not going to go re-review that. But we had this idea of a mutable live data list. Okay, so this is the thing that sort of lives inside the view model. We have this init method, which gets called when the view model is first created. And then we have a method, in the case of restaurants, it said get restaurants, which returned a live data list of restaurants. So when we build our view model for comments, it's almost identical. The only difference here is that we have this ability now to pass in a restaurant ID. So when we go to do our database query, it's going to be based on a restaurant ID. We're going to have an additional condition that we need to look for. Yes. So in the okay. So I'm going too fast, is what I'm hearing. So yeah, just tell me to pump the brakes anytime. Let's first just sync this to GitHub, and what I'll do is I can put this into the group chat. Okay, so that's, I just put that into the group chat so you can copy and paste it for the comment view model factory. And then I will paste all of, is that the only piece you needed? Was just the view model factory? Okay. Okay, so for everyone else on the chat, are there other things you need besides this particular screen? Let me know. If you're good, give me the thumbs up or or to say all good. I'll just give it a minute. I don't want to go too fast. I know it's a lot of little parts here.
Could you maybe re-explain the PowerPoint slides you were just on? Because I was too busy trying to type everything. I was not paying attention to what you were saying.
Okay, absolutely, no problem. Push this. Yeah, it's a lot of big picture stuff with this with recycler view and the view models. But once you get your mind around them, they're not bad. They're not hard to use. Okay, so let's go back a bit. So our goal for today, to get to this point where we can commit comments, we had to have an activity to register the comments. So we did that. And that we've been doing kind of every week. We've been adding a new activity. So I'm guessing there wasn't too much confusion there. And then we had to create a click listener so that we could move from the restaurant grid activity into the comment activity. And the way that we did that was we adjusted our grid adapter. And the way that we adjusted it was we created an interface inside of our grid adapter that says you need to have a function called restaurant selected that passes in a restaurant object. Because if you have a restaurant object, you can get the name, the ID, whatever you want. And we connected it to those individual elements in the recycler view right here in this method. So inside of onBind view holder, we said for each item, for each view holder, set a click listener that if it's clicked, if that view is clicked, it will call the method restaurant selected and pass in the current restaurant. So that was on the adapter side. So again, the goal of the adapter is sort of the bridge between our data from our view model and our actual layout files. Okay, so that's now adding that click listener onto the individual elements in our recycler view. And then in the actual activity file, what we said was our activity, by default, it extends the app compat activity, but we said it also extends this restaurant listener interface, or we implement it. And so when we did that, it said, well, if you're implementing that interface, you have to have a method called restaurant selected. And so in here, we said, well, if we're given a restaurant, right? So you click on it, it will call this method restaurant selected. And because you're clicking on it, it knows its current restaurant. And so we created an intent to go to the comment activity, right? So that the intent is what we use to change scenes or activities. And then we created, in the intent, we said put extra. So put this extra information into the intent so we could pass in our restaurant ID and the restaurant name. And we passed that into our comment activity. And what we're about to do now is set up this comment activity so we can send information into Firestore and read information from Firestore. Now the challenge is with what we had before. If we look at our restaurant list view model, question in the chat said those names could be anything, right? It's just a key to the value pair. Yes. So if you're talking about here where I said restaurant ID, yes, they can be anything. My recommendation is keep them pretty closely related to whatever the material is, of course, so it's easy to know. So when we get to the comment section, something's a little bit different. Exactly, yes. That's why the capitalization, everything's critical. When we built our view model for restaurants, the first view model here, when we queried our database, we didn't have to pass any information in. We just said, Firestore, get us the instance, so connect us to the database, attach to the collection called restaurants, and give me all the documents. Okay, so again, if you're not used to the naming convention of these, I've been signed out. Oh, come on. All right, looks like I have to sign in. Okay, so we have collections, so we attach to our restaurants collection, and that gave us access to all of our documents. And inside each documents, we had the fields. So before, when we did this, when we connected to get information out of Firestore, we didn't have to supply any information, right? We just said, give us all the documents. Now, in the case of the comments are going to be related to one specific restaurant, right? So we're not going to get all the restaurants back. We want to get just the comments related to our specific restaurant. So that's where this time around, in our view model, I'm going to have to figure out a way to pass information in to load these restaurants. And that's why we had to create a view model factory. And the goal of the factory is to provide inputs to our view model. And so that's where we created our comment view model factory. And the way we created it was we said, we gave it the name view model factory, but we said it extends view model provider.factory. And that forces us to have this method that checks if we're basically passing this information into comment view model. If that's the class that we're passing information into, then we just have to say return comment view model, and we pass in the restaurant ID. So there's, in the slides, what I was showing was there's not a lot of data you actually have to change in these factories. So we pass something into the factory, and then we're going to pass it back out. So there's not a lot of code in here that you really need to modify or play with. And then the same is true with our view model. So our view model, now we have the ability to pass information in and use it. So what we're going to do is pass information in, and then we're going to query Firebase Firestore. This piece is pretty much the same in our view model. We have a mutable live data list, and then we're going to have a method, in this case it's called getComments, that will return a live data version of that list. So in that sense, it's very similar to what we did with restaurants. The only big difference is this ability to pass in information. So I'm open to questions. Like, please ask away. If that's better, I'll keep going. If it's still feeling really muddy, I'll try explaining it a different way. Let me know.
So I guess for me, I'm still stuck on like how the comment activity and the comment factor are still kind of intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I think this is also like we just started learning, like getting into it. still be more clear.
Yes. So it could be that, and it could be, for me, when I had, I'll call it the aha moment, was actually when I started experimenting with it kind of on my own. Because sometimes just that experimentation where you tinker, all of a sudden you're like, I get it now. So where that connection's happening is in our adapter. So if I go to this big wonderful series of things here, this is what I'm trying to get across here is this idea of the flow of information in these using view models. So what we have with our restaurant list activity or grid activity is we created this view model which queries the database and returns a list of restaurant objects. And I'm gonna ask a couple questions along the way here. Is that part comfortable? Like the purpose of the view model is query the database, get back a list of restaurants. That part?
That's fine.
That's fine. Okay. So then we have this situation with the recycler view where the recycler view has all these placeholders for items. And inside each of those items, we have an individual layout file. So when we go down here, like our grid restaurant, those items, we can specify how each of those items are laid out. Okay, so on this side, on the left side of this diagram, I have the layout. So I have my data and I have the layout. And what I need is something that can get from the data and put it into the layout file. And that thing is called an adapter. Okay, so it's going to basically loop over top of my collection of restaurant objects and put each of them into one of these layout files. So at that 10,000 foot level, that's its purpose in life, is it's adapting from a data set into a layout file. Hence the name adapter. Oops. So it's in here in this adapter that we can add other attributes, if you will. So what we said was, okay, this item here, when someone clicks on it, what do we want it to do? So in our adapter file, so here's our adapter file here. I'm just going to remove those lines of code because I feel like they could be confusing people. So inside that adapter, we're gonna keep looking at this at like the high level because I feel like it's actually easier to look at it that way. So at the high level, this adapter does a few things. One is it has the view holder, and the idea of the view holder, I believe it was miles. I'm going to explain it in miles and ease. So the purpose of the view model was, to view the models. Well, actually, the purpose of a view holder actually holds the views, and so it's actually a good name. So what you see, each of these items like name, text, view. They could have called it rating bar view. Each of those elements is a view in itself, and so when we have this custom view holder, we're basically packaging it together so that we can pass it around in an easy way. That's why we create our own little kind of custom class here. And so this onBind view holder, so the name's actually a good name because what it's doing here is it's taking that view holder, which is accessing the individual little elements, and it's binding them with the specific restaurant data. So if I expand it, what we pass in is the restaurants, the list of restaurants, and a particular position, because the superclass, this is going to loop over all of the restaurants. So we're only looking at one specific restaurant in this method on bind view holder. And what we're doing here is when it says with view holder, it's like saying view holder dot for each of these things. So we're saying the name of the restaurant can get from here, and then the rating we get from restaurant.rating. And then we did one thing further, and that extra thing we did is for the whole view holder, we said set an on-click listener. So if this view holder is clicked, if it's selected, we're going to call a method called restaurant selected and pass in the restaurant. So that's that's how we're triggering that restaurant selected method to be called. Is that and it may be, as you said, like maybe it's a matter of playing with it, but does that help a little bit, smidge? It makes sense. Okay, good. So so when this method is called, that happens, we have to pass in this from our activity side. So this is our adapter. So if we go back to our diagram, this is our actual adapter. But just like, you know, if you think of an MVC model, now the user is actually interacting with the view, right? So if I drew a person over here off to the side, they're going to click on the view, which is sort of, you know, interacting with the activity. So that's where in the activity class, in here, we had that method that says, okay, if a restaurant is clicked, it's now it has to call a method called restaurant selected, and that's where we set up the intent to pass in the restaurant ID, the restaurant name. So that's how they're pulling these two things together. And I love the questions. Thank you for asking them. I struggled with this a lot. I mentioned it earlier in the class. So, you know, the more everyone tries to pull information out of me, the better, because hopefully I'll explain it, you know, a few different ways, and it'll start to really resonate. So we've got now a restaurant ID. We've passed it into the comment section, and we want to query Firestore to get all the existing comments out of Firestore. But we can't directly do that because the view model itself isn't designed in such a way that it allows you to pass information into it. It likes to get its information from an extension of the view model factory class. So that's where we had to create our own custom view model factory to allow us to get the restaurant ID and pass it into our view model. I didn't design it. That's how they designed it. So we have to live within their framework. So we've got our restaurant ID, and we need to pass it into a view model factory. So to create our view model factory, it's mostly boilerplate stuff. Really, the only thing that changes is what you pass into it, and then what you pass out of it to your view model. So in red is all that you really have to modify when you're setting up these view model factories. So when I first started playing with these, I had this uneasy feeling in my stomach, and it was just like, I don't understand what this is really trying to tell me, but it's actually not doing a ton here. Yeah, that's the magic box part. So you see here, we're extending the view model provider.factory class. So there is work happening in the parent class, this view model provider.factory, right? So all that we're really doing inside this custom class we've created is we are making sure that we're using the comment view model class. And if we are, then we can pass in the restaurant ID. It's like I do nothing, but then it works, so yay. Kind of. It's, you know, if you think about a lot of things in coding, there is sort of a black box to it, right? You know, if you think back to your advanced Java course, all you had to do was say extends application in your main class, and all of a sudden, boom, right? You got Windows, you've got Stage, you've got all these things that you can interact with. It's got a whole nother thread that's living. You didn't have to do much. So the same is true here with these view model factories. You're not really having to dig into what's happening inside the view model factory. You just have to really know how to use it. I hope that's it's okay for you to understand it that way. Really, there's not a lot to it. So now that we have that view model factory, and we're coming up to a point where we'll probably take a little break. Our comment view model, we have this ability now that we can pass in a string, which is going to be our restaurant ID. And when we query our database, we can use that restaurant ID to query the database. And then we'll get our live data, just like we did with our restaurants. So why don't we take that as a natural spot to take a little bit of a break and let it digest. It's a lot of conceptual information, a lot of theory there. When we come back, we'll wire this up, and then we'll see that we can write and read from the database. And we'll set up an adapter so that we can look at our recycler view of comments as well. So let's see, I got 1:52. How about we come back at 2 o'clock?